Sponsors for the month of Kislev, Sammy and Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents Yitzchak Leib and Aaron Cohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, and Hinda Bas Hemech Ephraim. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an Aliyah and the family Einacham. We also thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Danny and Gail Cutler, in honor of and as a zechus for Seth and Rachel Rotenberg, and with great appreciation for all of the shiurim. And also with that, let us begin. So an incredibly exciting day today. We are going to Meretz Hashem, hopefully conclude the parak, and in Meretz Hashem conclude the sugya of Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKohanim. So today's daf, for the Chanukah, so today's daf is daf Chof 20. We are picking up, I will say, from your Testament base. We're going to move fast. We're going to do a lot today. So Meretz Hashem, we are picking up your Testament base 19b. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 lines up from the bottom. In the middle of a discussion. So remember, we spoke about Suffolk Roke, the exciting world of saliva, about what's the status of saliva found in Yerushalayim, depending on where you find it. Now we're going to continue in that same brace and focus on Kalim. Kalim Tanina. We also learned about Kalim. We also learned about the halachos concerning utensils. What does that refer to? This nan kala Kalim hanin sambi Yerushalayim derech yerida lebeis hatvila tameyin. This is actually a very interesting halacha. In general, the Gemara says any. 1 second, I'm sorry. Hopefully, we're going to have time today. I'm going to do with you also a significant amount of halacha lamaisa, but we'll see what we get to. Good. So Kalim kala Kalim hanin sambi Yerushalayim derech yerida lebeis hatvila. We'll say any Kalim that you find on the way down to the mikvah. So again, in Yerushalayim, Kalim, utensils you found on the way down to the mikvah, Tamein, ultimately again they are Tamei. Because I will say the assumption is that when you find Kalim on the way down to the mikvah, those Kalim were Tamei, and they were dropped on the way to their immersion. On the flip side, so the Gemara says, well, the inference from that is Had Alma Tahorin. But what that tells me is in general, other Kalim that I find, ultimately again are Tahar, or the Tamech, but using that same logic, Ema Seifa. What about the end of that very Mishnah that says Derech Aliyah Mitarin? We'll say what Mishnah says, but if you find Kalim on the way back from the mikvah, the way up from the mikvah, ultimately again they are tahar. What would I infer from that? It's only Derech Aliyah, only on the way up that's tahar. But if you find Kalim in general, ultimately they'll be assumed to be tamein. Hada alma tamein. Ela reisha dafka seifa lav dafka. Rather, also what you have to say is as follows: the reisha of the Mishnah is precise, namely, any kalim you find derech irida, any utensils that you find going down to the mikvah, ultimately again are always assumed to be tamei. But yet, interestingly enough, the Seifa, which says derech aliyah, kalim that you find going up from the mikvah, tahar, that's not precise. There are situations where you find kalim derech aliyah, and yet halacha l'maisa they will not be tahar. What's an example of that? The Gemara says lafuke gazaisa. He gives an example. Rashi says over here gazaisa is mavuos kitanim. Okay, thank you. Mavuos kitanim shayu savok. So we'll say these are small alleyways. Small alleyways, ultimately again, that were kind of around the mikvah. They could be used both to go down to the mikvah as well as to come back from the mikvah. That halacha l'maisa, again, under those circumstances, those types of alleyways, safek kalim will be tamei. And when we say safek kalim, in other words, kalim with safek tuma ultimately will be tamei. Good. So we'll say back to the cow case, because remember again how we got into all of this. Kohen shechted a sacrificial animal. He opens up the sacrificial animal, he finds a needle inside of it, right? So what's the halacha? The halacha is his hands are tar, the knife is tar, but the basar is tamei. I see the Gemara says, 1 second, let's analyze this. But according to Rav, who set up the case, as I know this is a needle, there was a needle that was tamei tumas meis. The needle came in contact with, let's say, a person who touched a corpse, and therefore, again, the needle itself was an av. And now, again, so according to Rav Hussein, and I lost the needle, now I find the Kohen finds the needle, it's inside the cow. According to Rav, that's the case. Kevon damar b'chalal cherev harehu kechalal adam v'kelim nami litame. So we'll say if we are dealing with a needle that is an av hatuma, How was the needle an avatoma? Because remember, again, we spoke about this yesterday and first time on Shabbos. Metal has this unique quality that halacha l'maaseh, it assumes the same level of tuma as the source. So if a person who touched a corpse, becomes an av. Person who touches a needle, therefore, make the needle an av as well. If we are dealing with a needle that is an avatoma, then I don't understand why is it just the meat that's tameh. The truth is the knife should also be tameh, right? Because ultimately an av is metame ochlin, but it's also metame adam v'kelim. So halacha l'maaseh again, why wouldn't the knife, why wouldn't the kohen be tameh as well? Rav Ashi, this is fascinating. Zos omeres azara rishus harabim hi v'havide safek tumas rishus harabim v'chol safek tum rishus harabim svekotar. Incredible. Because Rabbi say, what is this? This is a case ultimately again of safek tum. Remember again, Rabbi say, when we say the kohen recognizes his needle, so remember again, it's clearly still not definitive. It's still a safek case. Also, listen to this. The Azara, the Gemara says, the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, which remember again, for this situation, when we talk about Azara, there are effectively two courtyards of the Beis HaMikdash. There's the large, what we'll call outer courtyard. That's where everyone is permitted. But then remember again, you go up a series of steps. There's a platform. That platform is called the Duchan. The Duchan, that's where the Levim would sing Shira from. And then there's another set of steps going down into a smaller courtyard. In that courtyard, that's where you would have the Mizbeach HaChitz on the outer altar, the rings that would hold down the animal for Shechita. So when we say that you're finding it in the Chatzar, it really means that inner Chatzar, because that's where Shechita ultimately took place. So the Gemara says something amazing. That Azar, that courtyard has the status of a Rosh Hashanah, a public domain. We'll say, what is the halacha with Safek Tuma Birshus Harabim? Safek Tuma Birshus Harabim is always considered to be tahar. It is only a Safek Tuma Birshus Hayochid that is considered to be tahar. We'll say, where do we get this from? So this is actually pretty incredible. If you take a look at Rashi, actually you have to take a look at Rashi. We'll say, as we're going to see in just a moment, all of the halachos of Tumah are learned out from Sota. Right? Sota, the woman suspected of committing adultery, is the paradigmatic case of Tumah. Remember, Sota occurs where? In seclusion. So Sota is a case of Safek Tumah. We're not sure, is the woman Tameh or not? Did she commit adultery or not? And I will say, where does that Safek Tumah take place? In Rishus Hayochid, in a private domain. That creates a principle for us that only a Safek Tumah Birshus Hayochid is going to be Tameh. A Safek Tuma Bereshus Harabim is going to be ruled Tahar. So the Gemara suggests over here, I have a Safek needle. Well, I don't have a Safek needle. It's a Vadai needle. I have a Safek if the needle is Tameh Tumas Meis or not. Isn't that a Safek Tuma Daraisa, especially again by metal, where the metal itself could be potentially an Av? Why isn't the Metame everything? Oh, because it's in the Azara. The Azara is Reshus Harabim, and Safek Tuma Bereshus Harabim is paskin on to be Tahar. Incredible. So the Gemara says, one second. The Gemara says, Michti, let's analyze this. Hai machat, this needle, davar shem dasli shalhu. Now, this is very interesting. A machat, a needle, obviously is something that cannot speak for itself. Right? Cannot speak for itself. So we'll say, so what is this? What does that mean? In other words, I will say, there are two different cases of Safek Tumah. If a person becomes Tameh, you could ask them questions. You could try to clarify the situation. A needle is an item, obviously, that cannot be asked anything. Ein bo das li shal. D'chol davar she'ein bo das li shal, bein birshos harabim, bein birshos hayochid, sveik otar. And I will say, in general, the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Good, I'm sorry. So I'll say, Sigmar is asking like this, why are you making this about the Azara being a Rishus Harabim? Even if the Azara was a Rishus Hayochid, this case should still be resolved as Tahar. Why? Because the needle is an item that doesn't have the ability to be asked. And in general, Abose, we say that any item, She'im Bodas Lishal, Sveikotar. Abose, where do we get that from? Again, remember, whenever you want to know about Hilchos Tumah, you always turn to one source, which is Sota. So remember again, Sota is a case, Sheyesh Ba Das Lishal. You can ask her questions. So therefore, what we learn from there is, it is only a case of Yesh Ba Das Lishal, where ultimately, again, Safek Tumah could be ultimately reckoned as Tameh. But if there's Ein Bo Das Lishal, if there is no ability to ask, by definition, the suffix is always resolved as tahor. So the truth is, it should make no difference whether the azar is Rosh Hashanah or the azar is Rosh Hashanah. At the end of the day, it's ultimately ein bo das lishon. I will say it happens to be, just as an aside, Rashi happens to say that the ein bo das lishon could also be referring to the sakin, to the knife. Okay, whatever it is, it doesn't matter all that much. What it matters is that halacha l'maisa, again, these are items that cannot be asked. So because of that, their suffix tuma is resolved by star. To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why this case is different. So I will say, so what the Gemara is suggesting over here is there are really two reasons why we could be makel in this case. Even if you want to say that the needle is an av hatuma, there's two reasons that you could resolve it leniently. Reason number one is why suffix tuma b'rshus hayachid. And number two is in bo das lishoel. To which the Gemara says, but 1 second, what about the fact of the following situation? The Gemara says, Mishum dahavi suffik tuma haba bidei adam. Both say this is a little bit different. There are two different cases of suffik tuma. There is what we'll call circumstantial suffik tuma, which means something happens. I didn't do anything, but something occurred. And then there's tuma haba bidei adam, or suffik tuma haba bidei adam, which means a person did something. See, I both say in this particular case, ultimately, again, the Kohen did something. What did he do? He shechted an animal, he's cutting open meat, and he came in contact with this needle. So we'll say this is called Safek Tuma Babi the Adam. I just want to point out three incredible Tuma principles in the first 12 minutes of the shir, right? Three incredible Safek Tuma Bershos Hayachid, ultimately tar. Number two, anything that has Kol Sheyesh Bo Das Li Shoel Safek Tameh. And now number three, Tuma Hababi de Adam Sveiko Tames, which is incredible, which is incredibly amazing. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan, Safek Tuma Hababi de Adam Nishalin Allah. So we'll say ultimately again, Rabbi Yochanan says, anytime you have Safek Tuma that occurs because of the actions of an individual, top of Chaf Amadalif, Nishalin Anishalin, which means mostly you have to ask about it. Afilu Bekliya Munach Agale Karka Kedavar Sheish Bodas Yishana. Mostly what that does is very interesting. Any situation of Tumah where ultimately, again, the individual is the one who causes the Tumah, halacha l'maaseh Rabbi said that transforms the item that is Tameh into an item sheyesh bo das lishoel. So what it does is essentially, the moment you're causing this situation, all of the other aforementioned leniencies tend to go ahead and fall away. So therefore I will say, so that's why it says, even if you have an inanimate object that is sitting on the ground, it transforms the object into an item sheyesh bo das lishoel. So therefore I will say, what the Gemara is simply bothered by is the notion that halacha l'maaseh, again, remember again, we have a lot going against us in this needle case, for the simple reason that the needle is metal. Metal goes ahead and is able to receive tumah laterally, so that the person who's an avat tumah touches it, turns the needle into an avat tumah. An avat tumah has the ability to transmit tumah to Adam and Kalim, which again poses for us a problem. Why? Because at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, why is it just that the basar becomes tamei? Why isn't it that the coin and the knife don't become tamei as well? So I will say, just so you should know, the bottom line answer to this is that the azara is reshus harabim, and safek tuma b'reshus harabim is dealt with as tahar. That's the simple answer to all of this. But amazingly enough, the Gemara goes through this exercise of Tumah and Tara. So three really incredibly important principles of Tumah that come out of here. Both say, so now listen to this. V'abasar tamei, hai basar dis kasher b'mai. So both say, ultimately again, Yankee Salmon asked this shaila yesterday. So both say, so that the basar is tamei. The Gemara says the meat is tamei. I don't understand, what was the hechsher? What was the hechsher? In other words, we'll say, what does that mean? Remember, in order for food items to become tameh, what has to happen? Has to come in contact with liquid. So what's the pshat? So how did this meat ever become the sacrificial? Ever become hukshel kabel tumah? To which the Gemara will say, so now you're tempted to say, inema dis kasher b'dam. What do you mean? Of course, you have the blood. You have blood, right? There's blood everywhere. So of course, blood is one of the zayin mashkin. Blood is one of the 7 liquors. We'll say, we already know the answer to this. Come on. But we'll say sacrificial blood does not work for hechsher tumah. We learned this already, right? Remember again, as much as blood ultimately goes ahead and is machshir item makabel tumah, not sacrificial blood. Why not? Shneimar lo sochlanu ala aretz tishbachenu kamayim. Because remember again, how do I know that blood is one of the 7 liquids that is machshir lekabel tumah, that allows an item to receive tumah? Because the Torah compares it to water. Where does the Torah compare blood to water? Ala aretz tishbachenu kamayim, which teaches us what? Only blood that is spilled on the ground like water has the ability to be machshir an item lekabel tumah, but blood that cannot be spilled on the ground like water, i.e. sacrificial blood, ultimately, again, does not go ahead and is not machshir lekabel tumah. So the Gemara says, "Shneimar lo schanar aretz kishuvenu kamayim, dam shenishbach kamayim machshir." So blood that is spilled on that could be spilled on the blood that could be spilled on the ground like water is machshir. V'she'er nishbach kamayim eno machshir v'elo di'eskasher b'mashki debeis mitbachyo. Oh, okay. So maybe you're going to say, remember again, this meat is being butchered in the butcher chamber. So maybe there are the liquids of the butcher chamber. Those are the liquids ultimately that go ahead and make it hokshel lekabel tumah. Come on, we know that as well. Mashki beis mitbachya lo dayan shein dachan. So remember, we have Rabbi Yossi said in Rabbi Chanina that not only are the liquids of the butcher chamber tar, but what? Ela shein machshirin. Remember again, that was Yosef ben Yoezer. That was 3 days ago. Yosef ben Yoezer Hayid, right? Amashkin beis mitbachya dachan. Remember that was his lashon. That halacha l'maaseh again, the liquids of the butcher chamber, not only are they themselves not tamei, but they also can't be machshir in the kabel tumah. So what's the pshat? So how does the meat in question even become tamei? To which the Gemara says, "Ela dis kasha b'chibas hakodesh." Oh, so we were introduced to this concept yesterday, the concept of chibas hakodesh, that maybe sacrificial items are so holy that incredible holiness generates an overwhelming sensitivity to tumah, and maybe that enormous sensitivity to tumah ultimately allows it to be makabel tumah, even without first coming in contact with a liquid. Maybe that's what's called chibas hakodesh. Maybe again, literally, the love of kodesh as such makes it so sensitive that it's makabel tumah even without first being exposed to a liquid. To which the Gemara says, "Emer de mahanyele chibas hakodesh levsulei gufei lemimnei bei rishon v'sheni nami." So we'll say, remember, in general, when you have chibas kodesh, when you're going to make something tamei based on chibas kodesh, that usually allows an item itself to be makabel tumah. But it doesn't necessarily allow for what? It doesn't usually allow for an item to go ahead and make something else into a rishon or a sheni. In other words, we'll say, chibas hakodesh will allow the item to be makabel tumah, but generally will not allow the item to receive tumah in a level that it could transmit the tumah to other things. To which the Gemara says, Tivshot nami, because we could prove this, the fact that it says the Bayre Shlakish, Soril Shal Menachos Monim Barishon Mishini. I will say it's actually an interesting case. If you have a dry clump of mincha, so you have a dry clump of a carbon mincha that didn't come in contact with liquid. So I will say, does it have the ability ultimately to go ahead and make something else into a rishon or into a sheni? So you see from here, chibas kodesh. This is a very important principle. The concept of chibas kodesh, which says that because something is so holy, therefore it is sensitive and receptive to tumah. I could even hear that to tell you that what? Even if the item in question doesn't come in contact with a liquid, it should still become tummy because of chibas kodesh. But will chibas kodesh actually allow an item to be mekabel tumah and transmit tumah? That's not so pashut. So Rav says, so again, we're back to our simple question. The piece of sacrificial meat in the Gemara, how did it become hokshel lekabel tumah? Here we go. Amr Rabbi Yehuda Amr Shmuel ki gon shaisa parashal zivchei shlamim ve'avira bin nahar. So we'll say, here's the case. Rabbi Yehuda says, name Shmuel, what's the case? We're talking about a para, right? Say the cow of zivchei shlamim, and what happened? You brought it in the river. So we'll say you're bringing it to Yerushalayim, to the Beis Hamikdash. You brought it across a river. V'shachta, and you went ahead and you shechted it. Va'adayin mashke tofeach aleh, and it's still wet. That's the case. Okay, Sheikh's will says you brought it to the Beis Hamikdash crossing through some type of channel of water, some big puddle, and not too many rivers around Yerushalayim, right? So again, you go ahead and you bring it through a big puddle. It becomes wet, and when you shecht it, it's still wet. So that water from the puddle that it traversed ultimately still allows it to be makabel tuma. Good, beautiful. So we'll say, remember again, the Brisa then went on. Nitzah b'perish hakol tar. Remember, the Brisa said that halacha l'maisa, if you find the needle in the excrement of the animal, then halacha l'maisa, everything is tar. Remember, we'll say, if you find the needle in the basar, so the basar is tamei, the knife and the hands of the kohen are going to be tar. If you find the needle in the excrement, ultimately everything is tar. I says the Gemara v'nei hader peresh v'nit mayi lebasar. Why doesn't the excrement, which now contains the needle, go back and convey tumah to the basar? Amar Rav bar Ava beferesh Abba. So we'll say that question is predicated on the idea that the peresh is liquidy, right? The excrement is liquidy, and therefore it goes ahead and transmits tumah to the basar from mashkin to ochlin. So why doesn't that happen? To which the Gemara says we're dealing with solid excrement, thicker excrement, and therefore it doesn't have the status of a liquid, rather it has the status of a solid item, quote unquote ochlin, and ochlin can't convey tumah to other ochlin. So the Gemara says, Rav Ashi Amar Filu Tema B'Ferish Raka can even be with a liquidy excrement, Mishum Dahavi Mashke Saruach. Because we'll say again, it's considered to be a putrid liquid. And remember again, putrid liquids lack the halachic classification of liquids themselves. Good. Tani Tana Kamid Rav Sheshes. So we'll say another interesting case. So we'll say that closes out the needle in the sacrificial meat case. Pretty incredible. Tani Tana Kamid Rav Sheshes. Sheretz Matami Asamashkin. So we'll say, listen, great case. By the way, this actually would have been very helpful if we would have had this case a week ago. But look at this. Tani Tana Kamid Rav Sheshes. We'll say they taught the following case of Rav Sheshes. Watch this. Sheretz Matami Asamashka. So sheretz can convey tumah to a liquid. Mashki Matami Asakli. Liquid could convey tumah to a utensil. Kli Matami Asaochlin. Utensil could convey tumah to food. Va'ochlin Matami Asamashkin. And ultimately, food could convey tumah to liquids. Good. So the Gemara says, what do we learn from here? Shalosh tumas b'sharetz. So we'll say from here we learn that there are 3 levels of transmission by a sheretz. To which the Gemara says 3. Hani arbahin. That's 4. You just mentioned 4, right? So we'll say again, sheretz to the liquid, liquid to the kli, kli to the food, food to the mashkin. That's 4 levels. Why do you say 3? To which the Gemara says, you're right. Goes mashkin dereisha. Take out the first mashkin. So really the way it should read is sheretz to the ochlin, ochlin to the kli, kli to the mashkin. I'm sorry. Sheretz to the kli, kli to the ochlin, ochlin to the mashkin. So just take out the first mashkin. To which the Gemara says, Adrabah goes mashkin to seifa. Why? I understand you could take out liquids, but why not take out the last liquid? Why taking out the first one? Because we'll say at the end of the day, there's no one who says that liquids could convey tumah to a kli, el Rabbi Yehuda, except for Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda himself, Hadrabe. Rabbi Yehuda himself retracted that position. So therefore, I will say again, the progression here is very important. Sheretz to a kli, kli to ochlin, ochlin to mashkin. That's the transmission of tumah. Now the truth is, mashkin can convey tumah to ochlin as well, as we'll see, but halacha l'maisa mashkin cannot convey tumah to a kli. Both say the Gemara is very interesting. V'simanach, and if you want to remember the order of transmission, nizaisa. Just remember how to make beer. This is great. We'll say, how do you make beer? Look at Rashi, nizaisa. Rashi says 5 lines up from the bottom. Seder matilei shechar. So we'll say, if you want to make beer, everyone knows how do you make beer. What do? So the Gemara says, So'orin tchila, nosten kli, v'achar kach ochel, v'achar kach mashke. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, remember, how do you go ahead and make beer? So we'll say, so remember again, the first thing you start with is a kli, and then after the kli, you go ahead and put in the barley or whatever the solid is, or dates in the case of date beer, and then only afterwards do you introduce the liquid. Okay, so beer is a good way to remember the transmission of tumah. Interesting. Weiter, Tanan Hassam. If you find the sheretz inside of an oven, so what's the halacha? So imagine the following scene. You're baking bread. You're baking bread in your oven, and now there's a sheretz inside of your oven. What's the halacha? So hapas shebesocho shnia mipnei shataner tchila. So we'll say, so the way this works is as follows. Now remember again, so the oven itself becomes a rishon, because remember again, the sheretz is the av. The sheretz, I will say, now remember again, this could take on a couple of different scenarios. Or for example, this could potentially be an earthenware oven, in which case the oven itself becomes tamei through the airspace, or just a simpler case could be where the sheretz touches the side of the oven, right? Remember again, the sheretz did not touch the bread. This is very important. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, sheretz is the av, touches the oven therefore becomes a rishon, and the oven goes ahead and makes the bread into a sheni. To which the Gemara says, one second, the Rava, we'll say, why don't we view the entire oven as being filled with tumah? We'll say, why don't we say that once the oven goes ahead and touches the sheretz, we view the entire interior of the oven as being filled with sheretz. Then I will say, what's the ramification? What's the impact of viewing the entire interior of the oven as filled with sheretz? Then what? And what? Then the bread itself is coming in direct contact with the sheretz, which would then make the bread what? A rishon instead of a sheni. To which the Gemara said, Amarle lo. Said no. Saradaitcha tisanya yachol yehu kol akelim tamein me'aver klicheres. So we'll say, listen to this. He proves it based on this brisa. He says as follows: You might have thought that all utensils should become tamei as a result of being in the interior, in the airspace of a kli cheres. Amud beis Rabbosai, Amud beis Talmud Lomar, Kol asher besocho yitma. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk says, anything inside of the kli cheres becomes tamei. V'samichle mikala ochel. And then I will say, ultimately, again, what does the pasuk say immediately afterwards? Immediately afterwards, the pasuk says, from any food items. Ochel mitame me'aver kli cheres. Ultimately, again, food contracts tumah. Ultimately, from the interior of a kli cheres. Ve'en kala kelim mitamin me'aver kli cheres. But ultimately, again, kelim, utensils, do not contract direct tumah from the interior, from the airspace of a kli cheres. I will say, now what does that show you? If indeed the interior of an oven was considered to be fully filled in with tumas sheretz, then even kelim themselves should contract tumah from the interior of the kli cheres. Because you also remember again, they're not contracting tumah from the kli cheres. What are they contracting tumah from? We'll say, imagine this for just a moment. If you hold that when there is a sheretz inside of an oven, of a kli cheres, then halacha l'maaseh, the interior is totally considered to be filled with sheretz, then what should be the status of a kli that is inside of that oven? Right? It should be ultimately again a rishon, because it's coming in direct contact with the sheretz itself. The fact that is not the halacha, right? The fact that halacha l'maaseh, again, a kli inside of the kli cheres oven is not considered to be a rishon, doesn't become tamei, indicates to us that the interior of the oven is not considered to be filled with sheretz. And therefore, going backwards, therefore, halacha l'maaseh, when you are baking a loaf of bread inside of an oven, and there is a sheretz inside of that oven, the way the tumah progression works is as follows. The sheretz conveys tumah only to the oven, and therefore the oven itself becomes a rishon. The oven then subsequently transmits tumah to the bread, which is situated on top of it, and therefore the bread becomes a sheni. So I'll say just an interesting havamina. I would have thought that the interior of a kli cheres is considered to be fully filled in with the sheretz, like it's one big sheretz sitting in there, taking up the interior space. Kamashwan that halachically we do not view it that way. Beautiful. So Rav Chisda, we'll say incredible. We are closing out this sugya now. So remember, we'll say, how did we get into this? I'm sure you've asked yourself that question many times over the last couple of days. Right? How do we? So remember again, this was all about Pesach. How was this all about Pesach? This all came about because of burning truma tameya with truma tahora on Erev Pesach. That's what this was all about. Can you burn truma tameya with truma tahora together on Erev Pesach? That's what I say, right? So again, based on that, Rabbi Chanina's Kana Kohanim came along and said, well, he didn't address that, but he addressed burning items of differing levels of tumah together. So we'll say now, we're coming full circle to that. So Rav Chisda, Rami Pischa, Pischo Mishani. Rav Chisda, he contrasted the case of Pesach, and he resolved it in the following way. Miyamar Rabbi Yoshua, Shtein Ka'acha. So we'll say, does Rabbi Yoshua actually say that halacha l'maaseh you could burn truma teluya with truma tameya on Erev Pesach? So in other words, does he hold that you could burn truma chametz teluya with truma chametz tameya together on Erev Pesach? Or minu, raise a kasha. Rabbi Yossi said, we'll say in the Mishnah, Ein hanidon dom l'rai. Remember again, we'll say, so the Mishnah wanted to bring Rabbi Chanina's Kana Kohanim as a proof that you should be able to burn Truma Tmei or Truma Tului on Erev Pesach. And Rabbi Yossi says they're not comparable. Rabbi Chanina Skana gave his testimony, what was he giving it on? Im alabastra shnitma bevlara toma shesarf and also alabastra shnitma ba'avatoma zet tame v'zet tame. Im alashem. So we'll say, remember again, Rabbi Chanina Skana was talking about a case of what? Two items, two pieces of sacrificial meat that were both what? Were both tame. True, differing levels of tuma, but tuma nevertheless. Imala shemshnev. So until yom shman they give us over there. So I'll say first wide line chafam days. And if you want to talk about Rabbi Akiva's case, right? Rabbi Akiva's case was where you're taking a oil that became tamei through a tevul yom and burning it ultimately again in a utensil that was tamei. That's also again the Gemara says. Zeh pasel v'zeh tamei. So again, the oil itself was pasel. The lamp, which had tumas meis, or was a rishon, ultimately again was tamei. So most say so burning. So remember, what the Gemara was saying is the comparison to Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim's case and Rabbi Akiva's case is flawed. We spoke about this extensively because Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, both items are tamei. Rabbi Akiva's case, one item is pasel, one item is tamei. But ultimately, again, af anu modim b'truma shenitma b'vlaratuma shesarf and also truma shenitma ba'avatuma. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi says, I'll agree with you that halacha l'maisa on Erev Pesach, if you have two types of truma, right? One type of truma that is tamei because of exposure to an av, and another type of truma that is tamei because of exposure to a rishon, I will agree with you that you could burn those two forms of truma together. That makes absolute sense because what we've seen from Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim is that when you are destroying tamei items, it doesn't really matter to us if you expose them to higher levels of tumah. So I'll agree with that legabe chametz. However, avahich nisrov afilu tuluya imatanea. Rabbi says Rabbi Yossi, but how can you burn truma tuluya, which is safek tuma, safek tamei, ultimately again with truma, which is vaday tamei? After all, shema yavo Elio, v'itari. Maybe Elio will come along, and Elio never will tell you that the truma tuluya isn't really tamei, but the truma tuluya ultimately again is tahar, and therefore it turns out that what? That Allah Chalamayse, you burnt a tahar item with a tamei item, and we don't seem to have any type of license to do that. To which the Gemara says, Umishani ha Rabbi Shimon v'alibud Rabbi Yoshua ha Rabbi Yossi alibud Rabbi Yoshua. So we'll say to which the Gemara said, you're right, it's a machlokes. It reflects two different opinions. Here we go. We'll say this Gemara is great because there's a little bit of a chazara of things that we did in the beginning of this sugya. This sanya, we'll say, here we go. Yodalut shechalios b'Shabbos. If Erev Shabbos falls out, Erev Pesach falls out on a Shabbos. So what's the halacha? Mevarin es hakomel lifnei Shabbos. We destroy all the chametz before Shabbos. The sarf and trumas, tameos, tuluyos, utahoros. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Meir says that on Erev Shabbos, we burn all leftover chametz that's truma, or all leftover truma chametz. And we'll say that's true whether it's truma tameya, truma tahora, or truma taluya. So whether it's definitively tamei, possibly tamei, or totally tar, we burn everything together on Erev Shabbos. Those are Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi Omer, tahora b'fnei atzma, taluya b'fnei atzma, tameya b'fnei atzma. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says, no, that is not the halacha. The halacha is we burn tahora, right? Truma tahora by itself, truma tameya by itself, and truma taluya by itself. Amr b'Shimon, lo nechluku Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, ala tahora b'al tameya shein sarfin. So we'll say comes along the Gemara and says, Rabbi Shimon says, even Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua do not disagree on the fact that you can't burn truma tamei or truma tahora. Those two items have to be burned separately. Ala taluya b'ala tahora shesarfin. And they also agree that what? That you can burn truma taluya with truma tahora. So what's their machlokes? Aman nechleku ala taluya v'ala tameya. But the machlokes is, can you burn truma taluya with truma tameya? Rabbi Eliezer or Tisaref zubatzma v'zubatzma. Rabbi Eliezer says you can't burn them together. You can't even burn taluya with tameya together. Rabbi Yeshua Omer shtein kachas. Rabbi Yeshua says that no halacha l'maisa, you can burn them both together. I v'hamas nisin Rabbi Yossi. But the Mishnah itself, our Mishnah, I'll say this Mishnah reflects you with Rabbi Yossi. So hachi kama Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Meir. So this is what Rabbi Yossi would say Rabbi Meir. Afilu Rabbi Shimon v'alibud Rabbi Yoshua demekel. Even Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi say, according to Rabbi Yoshua, who was the mekel sheet on this, ki mekel, when is he mekel? B'teluya u'temeya. We'll say at most he's going to be mekel to tell you that you can burn truma teluya with truma temeya. Avol B'tahora u'tameya. But halacha l'mayis again to burn truma tahora with truma tameya, lo, that you cannot do. So the Gemara says that's the first version. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, Rami truma pischot mishani. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, he contrasted the cases of truma and Pesach, and he resolved them. Listen to this. Miyamar Rabbi Yoshua shtehen ka'achos. Did Rabbi Yoshua actually say that halacha l'maisa you could burn both of these items as one? In other words, both say to go ahead and burn truma teluya with truma temeya. Did he actually say that? Or minhu? Well, so here we go. Chavish al truma shenola basafek tuma. We'll say what happens if you all just the chazar of all the cases we had before. You have a barrel of truma wine and it's safek tameh. We'll say what happens. Somebody tameh came in. Ain't not sure did they touch it or not. So the Gemara Rabbi Eliezer Omer. If the barrel itself was in an exposed area, you have to put it away somewhere secure. In other words, even though now there is a safek tumah that is hovering over this barrel of wine, you must still take care to protect it from further exposure to tumah. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, if it was out, you have to go ahead and put it away. If it was ultimately again uncovered, you have to cover it up. Rabbi Yeshua says no. And Rabbi Yeshua says no, not true. Once there is a safek tumah regarding that barrel, essentially, you don't have to guard it at all. We don't really care what happens to it. So ultimately, again, if it was in a hidden place, you could put it in an exposed place. If it was covered, yigal lena, you could uncover it. So what do you see? What do you see from here? Grama in biadayim lo. So we'll see even Rabbi Yoshua, who says that you no longer have to be as vigilant. That means you could stop exercising care and concern regarding the barrel. What can't you do? What can't you do? Actively defile it. So we'll say, so remember again, which would therefore mean, for example, you would not be permitted to go ahead and actively touch it if you're tameh, or you're not permitted to actually put a davar hatameh on it. So too again, even with the burning of chametz, you could burn you can't actively burn truma teluya with tameya. I'm jumping ahead. Umishani har Rabbi Shimon ali Rabbi Yoshua, har Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yoshua. Both say two different opinions. So both say ultimately Rabbi Eliezer Rami at truma mishani. So both Rabbi Eliezer tries to resolve the chametz case ultimately by contrasting truma cases. Umishani miyema Rabbi Yoshua grama in biadayim lo. Did Rabbi Yoshua just say that only grama is okay? In other words, both say that, for example, halach l'mais, in the case of the barrel, you don't have to protect it anymore. You could uncover it. So to cause additional tuma, bigrama, right, in causative tuma, that's fine. But to actively defile something that you can't do, or min horez kasha, chavish al truma shnishbra begat al yona, v'tachtach. Here we go, another case. We just had all of these cases. Good chazara. A barrel of truma. Remember again, this was the case, the barrel of truma wine that broke. That barrel is situated on an upper part of the press. Now it's going to leak down into a pool of chulin timeyin. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Moder Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shua Shem Yachal Lahatzim and Ravius B'Tari Yotzil. Everyone agrees that halacha, if there's the ability to save any amount of the truma wine, even just the Ravius, save it. Ve'im lav, and if not, what do you do? So we'll say, remember again, if I could save the truma wine, save the truma wine. What if you can't save the truma wine? So we'll say, remember again, what are my options? Option number one, when we say you can't save the truma wine, what does that mean? I don't have access to a tahar kli. That's what it means. So if I don't have access to a tahar kli, then what are my options? Option number one is don't do anything, right? If you don't do anything, then what happens? Then the wine, the chulin tmein becomes totally unusable because now it's what's called meduma. It's chulin with truma mixed in, it's unusable. Or second possibility is grab a tamekli and what? Catch the truma wine. What are you doing? Two things. Number one, you're saving the chulin, but what else are you doing? You're actively being metame the truma. So we'll say, so what do I do in that kind of case? To which the Gemara says, so if I can bring a tar kli, and save any amount of the truma wine, go for it. What if you can't? There's no tar kli to be had. Rabbi Eliezer says, just you have to let it go. In other words, we'll say what you can't do is you can't actively defile truma wine. And therefore, the act of taking a tamei kli and holding it under the trickle of truma wine is active defilement of truma. That you can't do. So you just have to let it be. And therefore, the truma wine will trickle into the chulin tamein, which again, so de facto, the truma will become tamei. But lamaisa, you're not doing it. You're not doing it. That's Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara says, Rabbi Shua Omer Yitamena biyad. And Rabbi Shua says, no. Again, we'll say it's a little bit disingenuous to say you're being mitame the truma. It's true, you're bringing a kli, that is tame, and you are using it to catch the truma. So on a technical level, you are being mitame the truma. We'll say, remember again, what happens if you do nothing? What happens if you do nothing? Truma becomes tame anyway. So it's not like you're causing something to occur that would not have happened had you not intervened. It's becoming tame regardless. So at least if you could save the chulin, save the chulin. The Gemara says, I'm sorry, jumping ahead. So the Gemara says, O mishani shani hasam dika hefsid chulin. And even though normally we would say, you're right, don't go ahead and intervene, don't make truma tameya. I will say, and even though in this case truma is going to become tameya, anyway, we still say, leave it alone, let it happen without you. But since over this hefsid chulin, there's a monetary loss. Because remember again, I could use chulin to meyin, but once the truma wine gets mixed in, the chulin is totally unusable. Maskif la mas nisin ami ike hefsid eitzim. But 1 second, I can make the same argument by the Mishnah. Both says, so that should be a good argument to say what? That Allah Chalamaisa should be permitted to go ahead and burn on Erev Pesach chametz truma tameya with chametz truma tahora. Why should I be able to do that? Because if you don't allow me to do it, then what? Then you're going to make me make 2 fires. And if I have to make 2 fires in one Rabbi say, then Allah Chalamaisa, that costs me extra money. So the same way that you allow me to go ahead and catch the trickling truma, because you don't want it, even though I'm going to make it tamei by catching it in a kli that is tamei, because you are allowing me to save the chulin. Because if I lose the chulin, that's hefsid. So you should allow me to burn chametz truma tuluya, or tameya, I should say, with chametz truma tahora, because if not, there's hefsid eitzim. I'm going to lose out on the amount of the extra wood that I have to use for another fire. Both said this is incredible. To which the Gemara says, Amalei Abaye, lehefsid meruba chashashu, lehefsid muat lo chashashu. Both say in general, when Chazal relaxed certain halachic standards in a case of loss, it's only when in a case of substantive loss. But in a case of what we'll call immaterial loss, Chazal did not relax their halacha. So we'll say this is incredible. Where do we learn this from? This is incredible. We'll say, from where do I know that Chazal were concerned only for substantive loss, but not for smaller amounts of loss? To which the Gemara says, listen to this. Desanya, Chabis shal shemen trumashin nishbara begata al yona. Well, at least begin this. We'll say this is really incredible. So now we'll say this is the same case as the wine, except what? Instead of wine, it's oil. Same case. So I'm in a press, and ultimately, again, I have a barrel of truma oil. The barrel of truma oil breaks, and what's below it? Begat al yono, b'tachtona chulin tamein. And on the bottom vat, because there's an upper vat and a lower vat, on the bottom vat, halacha l'maisa, again, there's chulin tamein. So now what's going to happen? The truma oil is going to trickle down into the chulin tamein. So we'll say, again, what are my choices? So again, if Modin, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shoshim, Yachol HaHatzal, and Rabbi Espatayra, Yatzil. So we'll say, everyone agrees that what? If you could find the tar kli, and what Rabbi saying, what? Save any amount of the oil, that's what you do. If you could save any amount of the oil, betara, that is what you do. But say, what happens if I can't find a tahar kli? So one more time. I can't find a tahar kli. What are my options? Option one, do nothing. And what happens if you do nothing? Everything is ruined, right? The lower oil, because remember again, the lower oil in the lower vat, which is chulin tamein, will become now unusable because there's truma mixed in. And ultimately, again, of course, the truma becomes unusable because it's mixed in chulin. Option number 2, what do you do? Grab a tamei utensil, and what? Catch the oil. What happens when you grab a tamei utensil and catch the oil? Well, you ruin the oil. The oil is now tamei. But at least what? Save the chulin. To which the Gemara says, you can't do that in the case of the oil. V'imlav tered v'tetame. V'aytan say, watch this. Unlike the wine case, where halacha l'maisa, again, there was an opinion that said that you could grab the tamei utensil and use it to catch the wine that is trickling down. In the case of the oil, everyone agrees that if all you could do is find a tamei utensil to go ahead and catch the truma oil, don't do it. Just let the truma oil trickle down, and obviously everything is lost. Ma'ishna, what's the reason? Shemen roi lahadlik. Ultimately, again, I would say, because remember, when oil of truma becomes tameh, we'll say it's not totally unusable. What could you use it for? You could burn it. You could kindle it. So you could use it as fuel for your candles. You could use it ultimately again to fuel a fire. So essentially, when oil of truma becomes tameh, it's a hefsid muat, not a hefsid meruba. It's not a total loss. It's a partial loss because now I can't eat it, I can't consume it, but lamaisa it's usable. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that it's only in a case of hefsid meruba, great loss, that Chazal relaxed some of the halachos, but in a case of hefsid muat, smaller amount of loss, Chazal did not relax at their stands. As I will say, I thought we were going to finish today, but the Rebbe ordained it a little bit differently. But here's the good news. The good news is Emir Hashem will have the great schos on Shabbos Chanukah to be able to finish a parak, Emir Hashem, and to be able to close out the sugi of Tum and Tara. And I will say, I'm going to have to give you, there's a lot of great halacha lamaisa on this, in the sugis of Tum and Tara as well. So Emir Hashem, we will continue, and Emir Hashem finish tomorrow.